Fooled ya! Hey everybody, I'm Joshua Orro, the Mustang Prince, and welcome to Mustang Prince Orro Reports. Now, believe me when I say that I've been planning this episode for 6 years now. But before we get started, let's talk about two of the most famous horror icons in the media. Let's start with Freddy Krueger from A Nightmare on Elm Street. Created by Wes Craven, Freddy was a child killer from Springwood, Ohio, who had been burned to death by his victim's parents after evading prison. Krueger goes on to murder his victims in their dreams, causing their deaths in the real world as well. In the dream world, Freddy is a powerful force and seemingly invulnerable. However, when Freddy is pulled back into the real world, he has normal human vulnerabilities and he can be easily destroyed. Over the course of the Nightmare on Elm Street film series, Freddy has battled several reoccurring survivors, including Nancy Thompson and Alice Johnson. Now, to be quite honest, while I have watched every single Elm Street film, including Wes Craven's New Nightmare, I never gotten around to blogging a single film starring Freddy Krueger, with the exception of the 2010 remake starring Jackie Earle Haley. And I also added Freddy Krueger on my top 13 scariest monsters in a live-action film countdown video back in 2016. Plus, there's only one person who I know who has reviewed several of these films better than I can. And that person was Brandon Nichols, the hardcore kid. Our second horror icon is Jason Voorhees from Friday the 13th. Created by Victor Miller, Jason was the young deformed son of camp cook turned killer Pamela Voorhees, who sadly drowned at Camp Crystal Lake when he was an 11-year-old boy due to the camp counselors who were supposed to be watching him making out instead. And years later, after Pamela's murder spree and her death at the hands of Alice Hardy, Jason has been haunting Camp Crystal Lake, slaughtering anyone he encounters by a burning need to avenge the death of his mother. And over the years, Jason has killed well over 200 people. And to this day, I still can't believe that Disney would have Donald Duck reference Jason in a Halloween cartoon. By the way, if you may recall, I shared my thoughts on most of the Friday films from 1980 to 1993, which was my very first episode on Mustang Prince Orro Reports way back on September 13th, 2013. And 6 years ago, I made a full blog on the 2009 remake, which I still stand by, with like a combination of the first 3 Friday films. Now, you folks are probably wondering, why did I talk about both Freddy and Jason? Well, because tonight is Friday, October 13th, you knew I had to get to their crossover sooner or later. So, let's get started. Released on August 15th, 2003, the movie is Freddy vs. Jason. Now, on for the plot of the movie. Years after the events of the final nightmare, Freddy Krueger is trapped in the bowels of Tartarus due to the children of Springwood having found a way to forget about him. So, the disfigured former Dream Master puts his risky but fiendishly brilliant plan in motion. He resurrects Jason Voorhees and manipulates him in the form of his mother Pamela to go to Elm Street and dispatch the kids. But unfortunately, Freddy's plans don't go according to schedule when Jason steals some kills, which really angers the Nightmare Demon. And that's when Jason finds out that Freddy has used him, which really sends him over the edge. Meanwhile, a group of teenagers stuck in the middle hatch a plan to get Jason back to Camp Crystal Lake and Freddy out of the dream world for both of them to kill each other once and for all. So, what do I think? Well, to me, this has got to be one of the best crossover films I've ever seen. I'm serious. I don't care what anyone says. This is a really thought-provoking, epic, thrilling, hardcore, and a badass movie. And to explain why, let's move on to Mustang notes. Now, I hear that this movie has had a pretty complicated history behind the scenes. Influenced by fan desire for a crossover film with a fight between Freddy and Jason, New Line Cinema and Paramount Pictures tried to make a Freddy vs. Jason movie in 1987, when Frank Mancuso Jr. enlisted Tom McLoughlin to unite the studios. But unfortunately, no agreement could be made. Negotiations on the project collapsed when Paramount made Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan, which was released in 1989. Afterwards, not only did it fail at the box office, but the rights were sold to New Line Cinema, and Sean S. Cunningham, the co-creator of the Friday films, began working with them on Freddy vs. Jason. However, before he could, Wes Craven returned to New Line Cinema to make Wes Craven's New Nightmare. This unfortunately put Freddy vs. Jason on hold, but it did allow Cunningham to bring Jason back with Jason Goes to Hell the Final Friday, which turned into a healthy profit. In a 1995 interview with Fangoria, Wes Craven was dismissive of the idea of Freddy vs. Jason, saying that it was taking something that had a lot of impact and dignity and dragging it down to another level. Cunningham's frustration with the delayed development of Freddy vs. Jason led him to create Jason X in order to keep the series alive. Sadly, the film lost its biggest supporter with the resignation of President of Production Michael DeLuca. The lack of support let the finished film sit for 2 years before it was released on April 26, 2002. Jason X was the series' lowest grossing film at the domestic box office and has had the largest budget of any of the films to date. And if you want to know my opinion about it, I don't really consider it canon with the other Friday films. In March 2002, after going through several different writers, newcomers Mark Swift and Damian Shannon, who afterwards wrote for DreamWorks' Shark Tale and the 2009 Friday remake, became hired after delivering a pitch that DeLuca was happy with. David S. Goyer, who earlier exited the film with his partner James Dale Robinson, returned to the project once again in an effort to trim every ounce of fat from Swift and Shannon's 120-page script. And in May of the same year, Ronnie Yu signed on to direct the film after being given an enormous amount of creative freedom. Filming for Freddy vs. Jason began in Vancouver from September 9th to December 10th of 2002. After the movie was released in theaters, while it did receive mixed to negative reviews from critics, thankfully, it grossed about $116.6 million worldwide, making it the highest grossing film in each series. Also to note, a sequel and crossover with the Evil Dead franchise was planned, but it was ultimately scrapped and it was instead turned into a comic book limited series called Freddy vs. Jason vs. Ash, and it gained a follow-up called The Nightmare Warriors. Now, as I said before, I was first introduced to the characters of Freddy and Jason back during my high school age when I was in a video production class at Trabuco Hills High School headed by Mr. Chip Walsh from 2007 to 2008. And at the time, one of the video projects that I participated in was a minute-long short titled Freddy vs. Jason. And as you can see by the footage here, I was chosen to portray as Jason Voorhees before I ever saw any of the original Friday or Nightmare films or their 2 reboots. And then, a couple years later, during my college age, while I was browsing through Netflix, I came across this DVD, and after renting it, I found it to be a really thrilling, badass, intense, and thought-provoking crossover. And nowadays, after renting and watching the old classics starring Freddy and Jason, I also found some parts to be pretty epic and nostalgic, due to some parts bringing back memories from the first Nightmare film, The Dream Warriors, The Dream Child, along with Jason Lives, The New Blood, Jason Takes Manhattan, and Jason Goes to Hell. Also, I found it pretty interesting that sometime after the final nightmare, the people of Springwood have found a way to forget about Freddy due to them taking Hypnosil and covering up any evidence of Freddy's existence, including removing any info or references from the old archives and public records. And everyone who ever made contact with Freddy became locked up at Weston Hills Psychiatric Hospital so that no one else could ever get hurt or killed. Plus, several other scenes that I thought were pretty memorable include the opening narration scene, which shows Freddy's backstory and recaps events from previous films, including the part where then newcomer Johnny Depp gets sucked into the bed blender. There's also the scenes at Weston Hills Hospital where the main heroes have to get Hypnosil for protection while Jason stalks them, the cornfield rave where Jason goes on a killing rampage, the scenes in Freddy's Nightmare Boiler, which were really intense and scary at first watch, the scene where the gang have to drive Jason all the way from Springwood, Ohio to Camp Crystal Lake, New Jersey, which is in reality a long 8-hour drive, and the final battle at Camp Crystal Lake, which in my opinion is the best part of the entire movie. Also to note, during the making of this blog, I discovered that Evangeline Lilly, years before she got to play Hope Van Dyne, aka the Wasp in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, was an extra in this movie. She can be found in the school's locker hallway when Laurie reunites with Mark and Will. Plus, I also find it surprising that to this day, the hardcore kid hasn't gotten around to reviewing this movie yet. However, there are a couple things in this movie that I personally consider as flaws, like a few scenes that involve smoking, alcohol, sexual innuendo, along with several adult characters being a bit dislikable, and it also includes the very thing that terrifies me the most: tranquilizer syringes. Anyway, that's all I got for Mustang notes. So, let's move on to the cast. Our main protagonist, Laurie Campbell, is played by Monica Keena, whom I remember from While You Were Sleeping. Laurie is an 18-year-old high school girl who lives at 1428 Elm Street, where Nancy Thompson and Jesse Walsh used to live. After her friend Trey was killed by Jason Voorhees and overhearing a cop say Freddy's name out loud, Laurie has been having terrible nightmares, which has started to restore the Springwood slasher's strength. And in my eyes, I think Laurie is a very relatable and sympathetic main character, due to the fact that her mom was brutally murdered 4 years prior, and I find a couple of the scenes between her and her dad to be a bit uncomfortable and spine-chilling. However, as the film progresses, Laurie starts to realize the truth about what's been going on in Springwood, and I thought it was very brave of her to go into the dream world to help Jason and pull Freddy out into the real world. And I liked the part where she used Jason's machete to decapitate Freddy, which would later be referenced in the 2010 Nightmare remake. Next is her best friend, Kia Watterson, played by Kelly Rowland, whom was in last year's Netflix Halloween film, The Curse of Bridge Hollow. In my eyes, Kia seems like a very nice BFF for Laurie, And I kind of like that she's the kind of person who sticks by and comforts her at times. Plus, I think her lingo is pretty cool. Though I kind of have mixed feelings about some of her fashion taste, and that she's always trying to hook Laurie up with some boy in order for her to get her mind off Will. Plus, I thought the part where Kia is pressured to give Jason mouth to mouth was very risky, and the part where she taunts Freddy before getting killed by Jason was kinda annoying, but at the same time, I understand that she did it in order to buy time for Will and Laurie to escape. Next up, we come to Laurie's boyfriend, Will Rollins, played by Jason Ritter, whom was in Raise Your Voice and Frozen 2. Will is a young man who's been dating Laurie when the two of them were 14 years old. Although they were young, Laurie insisted that their relationship was real. However, one night 4 years ago, Will crawled up to Laurie's bedroom window and he witnessed what he thought was her dad, Dr. Campbell, killing her mom. Afterwards, before Will could warn Laurie about what he saw, he was committed to the Weston Hills Hospital and was forced to take Hypnosil. After he saw the news of a murder at Laurie's house, he escapes the hospital with Mark Davis in order to help her. In my eyes, Will seems like a really nice guy, despite the fact that he has a personal vendetta with Dr. Campbell, and I thought it must have been really difficult for him to be locked up in a hospital for 4 years without any contact with the outside world. Plus, my favorite moments involving Will is the part where he steps in to stop Mark from scaring Laurie, and when he drives Laurie, her friends, and an unconscious Jason back to Camp Crystal Lake. Next we have Will's friend, Mark Davis, played by Brendan Fletcher, whom was in Air Bud, Leprechaun Origins, and Violent Night. Now, the reason why Mark was committed to Weston Hills was because 4 years ago, he suffered a nervous breakdown due to his brother Bobby allegedly committing suicide by slashing his wrist in the bathtub, courtesy of Freddy Kruger. After escaping from the hospital, Mark begins to dream again, allowing Freddy to murder him by setting his back on fire and leaving a message for Laurie and Will that Freddy Krueger has returned. Now, in my eyes, while Mark doesn't stick out as much as Will does, I find it pretty interesting that he seems to be an expert on Freddy's history, and I like that he lends Will his brother's custom van. However, the part where he freaks Laurie and her friends out at Springwood High School was pretty creepy and not very helpful after what she's been through the previous night. And the part where he acts like a true lunatic by pressing his butt against Dr. Park's office window was pretty silly, but also genius due to him somehow obtaining his ID badge so that he and Will can escape from Weston Hills. Another character to talk about is Deputy Scott Stubbs, played by Lachlan Monroe, whom was in Scary Movie, Daddy Day Camp, Space Buddies, Max 2, and Peacemaker. Stubbs is a young deputy cop who has been working for the Springwood County Sheriff's Department for a month before he became involved in his first major murder case taking place at 1428 Elm Street, where a boy named Trey Cooper had been brutally murdered. Later, after the Cornfield Rave Massacre, Stubbs tells his boss, Sheriff Williams, that the murderer might be a copycat of Crystal Lake killer Jason Voorhees. Unfortunately, Williams was adamant about preventing the spread of fear in Springwood, and he orders Stubbs to keep his mouth shut, otherwise he'll be locked up. Thankfully, Stubbs disregards his orders and decides to help Laurie, Will, and the other 3 survivors, and as soon as he finds them, he tells them about Jason's backstory. To me, Stubbs is one of my favorite characters in this movie due to him being a pretty good supporting character while doing his duty as a good cop, unlike the rest of the authorities who are consumed by their fear. And I like that he accompanies the gang to Weston Hills Psychiatric Hospital to get supplies of Hypnosil in order to provide them with marginal protection against Freddy Krueger. However, I did feel bad when Stubbs was killed by getting electrocuted courtesy of Jason. Though I am kind of curious as to how Stubbs knows about the Camp Crystal Lake killer's history. Finally, we come to Freddy Krueger and Jason Voorhees, played by the legendary Robert Englund and stuntman Ken Kirzinger. Now, as I said earlier, these two are some of the most famous horror icons of all time. And while they are pretty scary, I also think they're pretty darn awesome. However, between the two, Freddy serves as the main antagonist, while Jason is, unknowingly, a tool to create fear and give Freddy enough strength to return. Plus, while Freddy was able to kill Mark Davis with fire and possess Bill Freeberg in the form of a smoking caterpillar, I believe that Jason does a lot more killings in this movie. And like I said 6 years ago, I think his kills are very creative. Not only does Jason use his machete, but he also folds a bed in half to snap Trey's spine. He uses a broken pipe to impale Gib, which also saves her from Freddy, and he smashes a security door off its hinges to crush a guard named Stafford. However, the main reason why these two fight each other is because Jason realizes that Freddy was using him, while Freddy is angry that Jason just keeps on killing his victims. And I think their battles in both the dream world and at Camp Crystal Lake are both intense, thrilling, and hardcore moments. In the end, after a profane tank explosion, Jason, using the last of his strength, stabs Freddy from behind with his severed arm, and Laurie uses Jason's machete to behead Freddy. Other members of the cast includes Chris Marquette as Charlie Linderman, Catherine Isabel as Gibb Smith, Jesse Hutch as her boyfriend Trey Cooper, David Cope as Blake, Kyle Labine as Bill Freeberg, Tom Butler as Laurie's dad, Dr. Campbell, and Optimus Primal / Grounder himself, Gary Chalk as Sheriff Williams. And now on to my final words. Overall, Freddy vs. Jason has got to be one of the best crossover films I've ever seen. I think the cinematography and special effects are well done. The story is very nostalgic, thrilling, epic, and thought-provoking. The main characters, Laurie and Will, are relatable and sympathetic. Other characters like Kia, Linderman, Gibb, and Freeberg were pretty decent. Deputy Stubbs was a great supporting character, and the fight scenes between the two villains were just darn awesome and badass. However, I still don't like the fact that the movie includes smoking, alcohol, sexual innuendo, a lot of scared and unlikable adult characters, and tranquilizer syringes. Plus, like most horror films, I wouldn't recommend this movie for anybody under the age of 17. However, if you folks are horror fans or fans of Freddy or Jason, then by all means, give this movie a watch. I guarantee that you'll be in for a very thrilling battle. As for my rating, well, I'll give it a full 100%. Yeah, there were a few personal flaws, but who cares? Well, anyway, that's all for now. Be sure to join me for my next blog, where we look at the latest film taking place at Hotel Transylvania. Mustang Power.